History is not for the tenderhearted or the naive. So begins the first line of the first chapter of Kay Hymowitz's book, The New Brooklyn, What It Takes to Bring a City Back. And if you read the book, you'll find that history is for providing an unflinching look at the forces, both natural and sometimes disturbingly inhumane, that went into creating the Brooklyn of today. That history takes surprising twists and sharp turns and is not without irony. Kay Hymowitz is a skilled historian and astute observer of our current condition, and she's written the book that you wish you would have been assigned freshman year to get you right together with this gentrification thing. But for those of us who weren't, I'm happy to welcome Kay right now. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Brian.
And thank you for your book as well.
That's a nice thing to
So,
say.
right from the top, give me your working definition of gentrification.
Gentrification is the movement of educated, middle class or upper middle class people into formerly working class or more generally low income neighborhoods, in urban neighborhoods. That is not just my definition, that's the way it was originally defined. So in 1964, a British sociologist was noticing this kind of thing happening in her neighborhood in London, and she said, what's going on here? Little did she know that she was finding something that was going to become such a major force in modern urban life.
Well, speaking of that, little did she know, fast forward to now, could you have imagined that she could have imagined that gentrification would be a catch-all phrase for everything that's wrong in an urban environment?
No, look, she was probably not a little uneasy about what she was watching. She saw that there was not exactly displacement, because the working class that was whose houses were being moved into was dying off or moving on their own terms. So it wasn't exactly displacement, but she had to notice that this wholesale change in the neighborhood from working class to this, it was a kind of bourgeois, bohemian middle class, was something that was not altogether to the natives' liking.
Right, so not to the natives' liking. That sounds very much like the Brooklyn as we sit here today. So let's get right into it with the part of the book that everyone is going to highlight. All the reviewers point to, quote, the difficult truth, and it is immensely difficult, is that gentrification would be about the best thing that could ever happen to Brownsville.
Okay. So while we've been focused so much on the problems associated with gentrification, and there are many, and we should talk about those, so I don't want anybody to think that I'm sitting here going, this is great for everybody. It's not. But while we've been talking about that, what we've left out is poverty. And the truth is that concentrated poverty, and in the United States, concentrated black poverty in particular, is the biggest problem. And I say that's the biggest problem because those are the children in those communities have very, very little chance of moving up. Right. Now, I should say my interest in writing this book was largely to look into the issue of mobility. This has always been a concern of mine. Right. What allows people to get ahead? Right.
This whole American concept of the generation doing better than the previous.
Yes, and of course, and in a community like Brownsville, that has not been the case for generations. So what I tried to do was to look at why that was. And I'm not the first to think that sometimes when you have this concentrated poverty, it is harder for the residents, and particularly young people, to imagine a way out if they're not getting some vision from somebody else. And in the, one of the great works of modern sociology by William Julius Wilson argued that the ghetto, the black ghetto, arose in large part because the middle class blacks moved out. So I'm kind of making that particular argument.
So let's look at the Brownsville example. There was a moment where it looks like things were rife for the possibility of that upward mobility, especially at a time when Jewish people who had been longtime residents of this neighborhood and black people were sort of put together, and their children were the beneficiaries, where the old timers, the parents didn't really hang out, but you noted the kids went to the movies, they played together. What changed? What was the moment that, in the book, you really wrote eloquently about the Jewish people leaving Brownsville and getting the accomplishment of being consumed by the larger white mass after leaving Brownsville? Yes,
yeah. So, you know, because we focused very much when we're talking about gentrification on the black, as a white-black problem. We've left out that there was enormous prejudice and problems with all kinds of immigrant groups, the Jews among them, and they were not the only one. So Brownsville was, unlike a place like Bed-Stuy, which was at one point middle class, Brownsville was always very poor. It was Jewish poor originally.
Jewish tenements.
But the idea that the Jews that Brownsville had was their kids were going to get out. And that was always in the back of their minds.
And they themselves were Jews who had escaped the Lower East Side.
Many of them had. Lower East Side, Brownsville was bad in terms of the conditions, but it was a little better than the Lower East Side, where the tenements were so crowded and so disease-ridden. So they did come to Brownsville. It was, you know, largely tenements and little shacks and not particularly healthful climate. It was built on a waste site, you know. So, but they did see themselves as just providing a foothold into another reality for their kids. What happened we started to see more migration of blacks from the South and somewhat from the Caribbean, so that was not so much the issue in Brownsville. But more and more poor and unskilled blacks coming to Brooklyn, to many northern cities, just at a time that the factories were beginning to leave. Decline, So you've got this terrible storm that happened. Very poor, very unskilled people who also were being discriminated against. And then the loss of low-skilled jobs. So that was a very difficult time for the city, as well as, and of course for blacks in particular. So what happened was the Jews of Brownsville were very progressive in their thinking, and many of them had been socialists back in Russia, and you know, so they were all prepared to have a brotherhood of man in Brownsville and to join together, but they didn't get along so well once they were
neighbors.
Yeah, right. There were claims of racism both ways. There was increasing crime, which was happening all over the city, not just there, and they started to leave. And to be fair, what was happening was there were lots of housing projects being built by our good friend Robert Moses.
These towers in the garden.
Yes, right. And these were thought to be very enlightened places where you're going to provide airy, you know, like remember people's idea of where the poor lived were these tenements where there's no air, no windows, and sometimes not even indoor plumbing. So when the towers in the garden were built, people thought, wow, this is, you know, this is quite a move up, and they were looking at it with great excitement. But what happened was that initially, when they started to build a lot of these projects in Brownsville in particular, they were being built everywhere, but there became such a strong concentration of housing, of public housing, of the towers in the garden, that when the rules started to change about residency, and also when they put in place some rules that you didn't have to move out, and if you were making
income,
or that they raised that level, so people didn't leave.
Right.
And the public housing had always been built as a temporary way stop.
It went from transitional to generational.
Exactly.
Essentially.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the two sides of the coin of white flight and this black upward mobility, and how the Brooklyn of today is still experiencing the ripple effects of white flight and black upward mobility, particularly in a place like Bed-Stuy. That's the next place now.
Right. Well, Bed-Stuy is such an interesting case. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was just to show how each neighborhood has its own history, and that history somehow echoes into today. And that's true not just with Brownsville, but with Bed-Stuy. As I said before, Bed-Stuy had a wonderful stock of housing. I mean, it had originally been built for middle class.
Who were not black.
Who were not black. They were, but there were not that many blacks in Brooklyn at that time. In fact, that was in the late 19th century. And Brooklyn was under 1% black at that time. So, there may have been clusters of black families in various places, but there was no black neighborhood. And certainly Bed-Stuy was not that. But as they started to move in, and especially after the A-train was built.
From Harlem to Kingston and through.
Right. You did have a lot of whites moving. Now, they didn't move to the suburbs at that time. They were moving into further east and south into Brooklyn. The urge for more space and more greenery is something that predates the suburbs, or the suburbs as we know them. I live in Park Slope, as you know, and that was once considered a suburb because it was outside the commercial and industrial city. I mean, people didn't want to live in industrial cities. They were dirty, they were noisy, they were dangerous. And you did want that spot of green or more space. So people did move out that way. Now, eventually, of course, the city got all built up, and people started to move, and the highways were built, and people started to move more into the suburbs.
I want to talk about this interesting dichotomy. You had an example of a young woman in Bed-Stuy who talked about walking past the projects with her Trader Joe's bag full of groceries, and that was her internal conflict with this gentrification, being a brown person of some upward mobility, college educated, and what that means for our city. What do you think that's doing to neighborhoods in Brooklyn?
I think it's great, actually. I think, the more people we have who are middle class and of color, the more we have representations to show the poor who really don't feel any hope that there are possibilities. And we've been very busy, and not without reason, of talking about how little opportunity there is. And there is a real problem now with the changes in the economy and getting ahead. But historically, we have had a lot of mobility, and certainly Brooklyn was a launching pad into the middle class. And people left either for these places in the east and south Brooklyn or else for the suburbs. That was their way of moving up. And that didn't happen for a lot of blacks, in part because they were not, in large measure, because they were not welcome. But in a place like Bed-Stuy, you had a kind of lower middle class, policemen, nurses,
working
people, and they were devoted to those homes.
They were strivers.
They were strivers, and they were devoted to those gorgeous homes in Bed-Stuy. Although remember, they were moving in larger numbers just during the Depression, which was a terrible time for everybody. And a lot of those houses really decayed.
So knowing too, like as you wrote that has one of the highest concentrations of this generational turnover, where your grandma's house went to your parents, and now kids are coming back from college, assuming those same homes. So that being said, can black people be gentrifiers of Bed-Stuy or any other place they move
Well,
into?
there are, I don't have numbers on this, there are significant significant number of people who grew up in Bed-Stuy who are coming back after going to college. I mean, I give the story of one woman that I spoke to who opened a coffee shop, and she said, I went to college, and the way I got through college was drinking coffee, and I came back to Bed-Stuy. I couldn't find any decent coffee. She opened her coffee shop.
$3 later.
Yeah, right, exactly.
The gentrifying elixir
well,
as a black woman of color from the place. Now she's in politics. Yeah.
But I certainly met many people who were from the Midwest, let's say, who were moving into blacks who were moving into Bed-Stuy. So I think the black-white story in Bed-Stuy is a little bit overstated. A lot of the white population, we keep hearing about the rise in white population, and I've forgotten the exact numbers, but it's still 60% black.
The percentages look high, but the actual numbers aren't significant.
Yeah, but that's not 40% white. That's 20% white and 20% Hispanic. So it's quite diverse now.
Can we talk about the Chinese, though, as a gentrifying force? This was one of the most interesting parts, because the way you construct this, you're in Bed-Stuy, you're in Canarsie, you're in Sunset Park, you really get a feeling of a neighborhood and the vibrancy there. And the Chinese as a force of gentrification?
I wouldn't call it that, although it's...
You heard the rise in my voice. Gentrification?
I wouldn't call it that. Look, the Chinese who come to Sunset Park are extremely poor, most of them. They are just off the boat, as they used to say. Don't speak English, have no skills. What they have, and by the way, a lot of them are undocumented, which is an interesting little sidelight that I don't think people realize. They arrived into this community, and that community has a lot to tell them about how they want to get ahead in the United States. And it's been a very productive community in that way. The kids are doing okay. So that first generation, like I said, quite poor, quite uneducated, not speaking English, but they are fanatically devoted to their children's education. The joke I make is that the first English word they learn is Harvard. They're doing okay. Now they move out of Sunset Park when they
you talked about the rates of interracial marriage too. That's
they have very high rates.
So one other thing, we're talking about the moment that we're in now, and those immigrants, some of them undocumented from the Chinese community. What effect do you think President Trump and his actions on immigration will trickle down to the Brooklyn level? We've already seen a rise in street-level homelessness from folks in Sunset Park who are undocumented, who are essentially setting up shanty towns because they're on the run from ICE.
I think it's difficult to say. I don't know how many undocumented people there are in Brooklyn per se. The Hispanics, we do have several Hispanic communities. Somebody was just asking me, why didn't you write a chapter on the Hispanics? And maybe I should have, but I chose the two largest immigrant groups in the interest of time. The Hispanics in Sunset Park are Mexican largely, or Central American, and I would assume we have large numbers of undocumented. And I think the question that remains to be seen is how much the ICE and the government will be going after undocumented people who have no criminal records, and I think we still don't know.
So in our last moment together, you've done a lot of great looking backwards and taking the temperature right now. I'm going to ask you what the next 10 years is going to look like in these neighborhoods specifically, our Bed-Stuy, and really drilling down into the last frontier of Brownsville, East New York. What do you foresee coming 10 years on?
Right. I don't see much change in Brownsville, really. I mean, people sometimes say, oh, maybe there'll be gentrification in Brownsville, but I think because of the concentration of public housing, a lot of people are just they're not going to go, and they can't go, or rather they can stay as long as they want, is what I should say. I fear that the schools will not improve because that would be one sign of hope for people actually moving out. And then for Bed-Stuy, I think you'll see continuing gentrification, black and white. and others. You know, there will be, again, some housing tension, although there is a lot of regulated housing in Bed-Stuy too, and that can't be touched. So I think you'll see a fairly integrated community in Bed-Stuy, both economically and racially.
Yeah.
And I don't think you'll see that in Brownsville. Key to this getting ahead, to the mobility issue I keep bringing up, is education. You know, in previous generations of poor immigrants and poor in general who were in Brooklyn got ahead by getting these factory jobs. I mean, Brooklyn was an industrial city. It had millions of jobs.
You switch from an industrial economy to what you call a knowledge economy.
Knowledge economy, which requires a lot of education, a lot of skills. And our schools are not doing that great a job of giving kids those skills. Even a lot of the schools that have decent graduation rates, I hear all the time about kids who really have not been well prepared. So that's a real big concern. The other concern that I've written about quite a bit has to do with the family. Yeah. A lot of children, and this isn't just black children, but it's predominantly in Brooklyn, a black issue, are growing up in fairly unstable homes where there's not just a single mother, but a series of boyfriends coming in, and those kids, there is so much evidence, that social science evidence that we have at this point, that is not a good environment for children.
So some people are going to be pissed off by some of the things you wrote in this book. So why? If we're speaking to them, they would say the new Brooklyn, the upside of gentrification.
Well, look, I didn't want to, that's not the story I wanted to write. I think there are good things.
But you know that's the criticism.
Well, I know that will be a criticism, for anybody who bothers to read it.
Listen, it's a thick book for your brain, but it's only about 180 working pages.
It's not that long, people.
Right. Yeah.
No, and I did try to make it readable, but look, everything I say is based on research. You know, if I talk about when I talk about displacement, for instance, I looked at the research, which is different than listening to stories. And it may not be the stories that some readers are hearing or reading about elsewhere. And stories are important because they tell us on the ground what are people experiencing, but they don't give the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that displacement, or rather gentrification, although it's leading to some displacement, the research shows consistently it is not quite as severe as people imagine. And for the people who stay, they're better off. They're better off. There's consistent research on this. So if somebody wants to take that on, they should take on the research. That's not my idea. I wouldn't have actually even thought of it. So that's what I would argue, is let's look at what's happening. Let's understand what's happening. A lot of people think, oh, gentrification, that's rich developers coming in and throwing you out. But that wouldn't be happening if there wasn't a huge demand for city living. And that's one of the things that I discuss in the book, is how we got to that point. People are not leaving Brooklyn, they're coming here.
They're coming. They will continue to come, and I hope some of them read The New Brooklyn, What It Takes to Bring a City Back. Kay Hymowitz, thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you, Brian.